You know, we think we have a pretty good handle on how AI works. But what if I told you we've been using the wrong metaphor this whole time? Today, we're going to dive into a pretty radical new idea, that we don't teach AI, we actually sculpt it. This quote right here, it just perfectly captures this feeling that something fundamental is shifting under our feet. It comes from a fascinating discussion about AI, and it really hints that we're seeing more than just clever programming. We might be witnessing a whole new kind of intelligence taking shape. Okay, so here's our roadmap. We're going to start with this idea of the probabilistic parrot. Then we'll get into the main event, sculpting, not teaching. After that, we'll unpack something called the logic ratchet and ask the big question, is this real reason or just a convincing shadow? And finally, we'll look at what this all means for building an intelligent mind. So, let's start with one of the biggest puzzles in AI today. How is it that a machine can write a perfect legal brief, but then completely flub a simple logic problem? Well, it's because deep down, these large language models are masters of statistics, not strict logic.
This really breaks down the two classic ways of building AI. On one side, you've got symbolic AI. Think of it like a train on a track. It follows very specific rules, it's a super orderly or low-entropy system. It's precise for sure, but if it goes off the rails, it just shatters. On the other side are today's neural AIs. They're the complete opposite. They're high entropy. They're designed to explore this huge, chaotic wilderness of possibilities, which makes them incredibly flexible, but also kind of unpredictable.
And that's exactly why we call it a probabilistic parrot. It is an absolutely brilliant mimic. It's learned the sound and the rhythm of reasoning from all the human text it's read. It can imitate the patterns of a logical argument perfectly, but without actually understanding the rules behind it.
So if these models are just these chaotic parrots, how on earth do we get them to actually reason? Well, this brings us to the core idea of this entire explainer, a totally new way to think about training AI. We aren't teaching them, not in the way we usually think about it.
This one line, this changes everything. You don't teach a probability distribution, you sculpt it. What does that mean? It means you can't just upload a rule book. No, you have to fundamentally reshape the AI's entire internal world so that the logical path becomes the easiest path to take. Now, to really get this idea of sculpting, you first have to picture what's called a probability landscape. Imagine the AI's mind is this vast, hilly terrain. The process of training is like carving into that terrain. You're creating these deep, smooth valleys for the right answers, the high probability ones, and you're making these steep, impossible-to-climb cliffs for all the wrong answers.
So how does the sculpting actually happen? Well, it's basically a four-step process. First, you start with just chaos, a totally random landscape. Then, you feed the model thousands and thousands of examples of correct, logical thinking. As it learns, you reward the valid paths, which is like smoothing them out, making them easier to travel, and you penalize the wrong paths, making them steeper and harder. What you're left with is this beautifully carved low-entropy corridor of pure logic, cut right through that initial chaos.
Okay, so we've carved this path, but how do we make sure the AI actually stays on it? This is where we get to something called the logic ratchet, a really cool mechanism that doesn't just encourage logical thought, it kind of locks it in place.
And the key here is a technique called chain of thought. It's surprisingly simple, but unbelievably powerful. All you do is force the AI to show its work, to think out loud, step by step. And each one of those steps acts like a little checkpoint, keeping it right inside that logical corridor that we just carved.
I mean, think about what this really implies. Once the model generates a word or a phrase, that's it. It's part of its context now. It can't go back and change it. Every single step is a commitment. It's like a one-way gate that locks the model onto its path of reasoning and makes the whole process irreversible.
And here's where it gets really wild. This whole concept has a stunning parallel in biology. Inside our own cells, there's a molecule called ATP synthase. It literally acts as a physical ratchet, using its physical shape to only turn in one direction to create energy. Well, chain of thought is an informational ratchet. The sequence of words it generates makes moving forward along a logical pathway way more probable than turning back. It's incredible.
So all of this amazing engineering leads us to a really fascinating and honestly a pretty profound question about what is actually going on inside this thing's mind. Is it really thinking?
This brings us to the million-dollar question, doesn't it? Is the AI genuinely learning how to reason? Or is it just getting incredibly good at casting a perfect statistical shadow of reason, just mimicking the patterns without any true understanding underneath?
Now, the source material we're looking at explores two big possibilities here. The optimistic view is that logic is something called an emergent attractor basin. It's a fancy term, but basically it means that just like a ball will always roll downhill and settle in the lowest part of a valley, the AI's internal landscape is naturally finding the universal structure of pure logic all on its own. The pessimistic view? It's just a shadow caster, a puppet, and the second it encounters something truly new, the whole illusion will just shatter.
So, how do you push the model from being a shadow to being the real thing? Well, one really powerful idea is something called a verification loop. You basically have the AI generate an answer, and then you have a second process, maybe even another part of the AI, check its work for mistakes. You're basically teaching the machine how to be its own toughest critic.
Okay, let's zoom all the way out now for the ultimate takeaway. What does all of this tell us, not just about building AI, but about the nature of intelligence itself?
The grand theory here is that intelligence, whether it's ours or an AI's, it isn't some single magic ingredient. It's what happens when you stack these ratchet mechanisms on top of each other, layer after layer of processes that manage disorder and create coherent, directed action. It's amazing, right? Just like biological evolution built things like cell membranes and metabolic pathways, we are now building things like chain of thought and verification loops.
And this table just lays it all out so perfectly. The mechanisms we are literally engineering in AI have these direct parallels in biology. Our verification loops are like the error-correcting enzymes that work on our DNA. The constraint training we put models through is like the homeostasis that keeps our bodies in balance. In the end, both life and this new kind of intelligence are systems for managing chaos and creating order.
Which brings us to this really powerful, unifying conclusion. Maybe intelligence, at its very deepest level, whether it's made of carbon or silicon, is just what we call it when a system gets good at managing disorder, at reducing entropy, and at holding itself together in a coherent state over time.
And so, I'll leave you with a final, pretty provocative question to chew on. If an artificial intelligence can be sculpted to perfectly replicate every single output, every behavior, and all the self-corrections of genuine reasoning, at what point does that perfect shadow just become the real thing? At what point does the mimic become a mind?